They never imagined that a single shell could tear an entire battleship apart. December 13, 1939, the South Atlantic. HMS Exeter, a British heavy cruiser, spots something on the horizon, and what happens next will rewrite the rules of naval warfare forever. Because in the magazines of the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee, something is waiting. Something engineered with such precision and deadly intent that even the men who loaded it into the guns didn't fully understand its power. A weapon that weighed as much as a small car, stood taller than a man, and contained enough explosive force to vaporize steel, flesh, and hope in a fraction of a second. This is the story of the most lethal naval shell ever created during World War II. And if you think you know how naval battles were fought, you're about to discover that the real horror wasn't just in the fighting. It was in what was hidden inside these massive rounds, waiting to be unleashed. The year is 1936, and deep inside the Krupp steelworks in Essen, Germany, engineers are facing an impossible challenge. How do you sink a ship that's designed never to sink? Because by the mid-1930s, battleships have become floating fortresses, wrapped in armor so thick that conventional shells simply bounce off. And the naval powers of the world, Britain, America, Japan, Germany, are locked in an arms race, each trying to build ships that can survive anything the enemy throws at them. But here's the thing. Armor is only half the battle, and what Germany is about to create will make even the thickest armor meaningless. The weapon they're designing isn't just a shell, it's a precision-engineered death machine, and it starts with the casing, forged from a single piece of hardened steel in furnaces that burn so hot the air itself seems to shimmer. Because this steel has to do two impossible things at once. It has to be hard enough to punch through 16 inches of hardened battleship armor, and it has to be tough enough not to shatter on impact. And finding that balance is like trying to make glass that can also be used as a hammer. The forging process alone takes weeks. The steel is heated, hammered, heated again, cooled in precise patterns that align the molecular structure into something that doesn't exist in nature. And the workers know, they can feel it in the weight of these shells, that they're creating something fundamentally different from anything that came before. Because when you hold a 16-inch naval shell in your hands, when you see it up close, you realize this isn't just ammunition. This is artillery turned into art, twisted into nightmare. But the casing is just the beginning. And here's where the real engineering genius and horror comes in. Inside that steel shell, there's a cavity, and what goes into that cavity will determine whether a ship lives or dies. Because the explosives they're using aren't simple gunpowder, they're compounds with names like TNT, amatol, and shellite, chemicals so unstable that a single spark could destroy the entire factory. And the amounts they're packing into each shell? Over 300 pounds of high explosive per round, enough to level a city block. And it's all compressed into a space barely larger than a trash can. If you're fascinated by hidden WW2 secrets like this, make sure to like the video, because what comes next gets even more incredible. But here's the question that kept these engineers awake at night. How do you make sure this massive bomb explodes at exactly the right moment? Too early, and it detonates before penetrating the armor. Wasted. Too late, and it passes completely through the ship before exploding. Also wasted. And the answer lies in one of the most diabolical pieces of technology ever created. The delay-action fuse. A small mechanism at the tip of the shell that has to survive the shock of being fired from a gun, a force of over 40,000 Gs, more than enough to turn a human body into paste. Then survive slamming through hardened steel at over 2,000 feet per second, and only then, only after it's deep inside the enemy ship, Only after it's surrounded by machinery and ammunition and men does it trigger the explosion. The German Type AZ fuses are masterpieces of mechanical engineering, containing springs, pins, chemical delays, all working in perfect synchronization. And inside each fuse is a tiny vial of acid that, upon impact, breaks and begins eating through a thin metal barrier. And when that barrier dissolves, usually about 0.03 seconds after penetration, the detonator fires, the explosive chain reaction begins, and hell is unleashed from within. Now picture this. You're a sailor aboard HMS Hood, the pride of the British Royal Navy, the largest battle cruiser in the world, and it's May 24, 1941, and you're engaging the German battleship Bismarck in the Denmark Strait. And from 14 miles away, so far you can barely see the enemy ship on the horizon, Bismarck fires. And for the next 30 seconds, shells weighing nearly a ton each are arcing through the sky at speeds that create their own sonic booms. And you can't see them, you can't hear them until it's too late. And then one of them, just one, strikes HMS Hood near the ammunition magazines. What happens next takes 6 seconds. The shell punches through the deck armor like it's paper, penetrates 40 feet into the ship's interior, and then the fuse triggers, detonating 330 pounds of high explosive directly next to 200 tons of cordite propellant charges. And the explosion is so massive, so instantaneous, that Hood literally breaks in half, her back snapping like a twig. And of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survive, because the rest are either vaporized in the initial blast, crushed when the ship folds in on itself, or trapped in compartments that flood in seconds as the wreckage plunges toward the ocean floor. 3 survivors, from a crew of nearly 1,500, all because of what was inside those shells. And if you want to discover more untold WW2 stories and deadly hidden technologies, subscribe now, because what you're about to see next will blow your mind. But here's what makes these shells even more terrifying. They're not just designed to penetrate and explode, they're designed to maximize devastation once they're inside the ship. Because naval architects know that the real vulnerability of any warship isn't the hull, it's everything inside it. The engines, the magazines, the crew. And these shells are specifically engineered to create catastrophic secondary explosions. And the way they do this is brutally simple. The explosion doesn't just create blast pressure, it creates thousands of high-velocity fragments, pieces of the shell casing that are propelled outward at speeds exceeding 3,000 feet per second, fast enough to slice through steel bulkheads like they're made of cardboard. And each fragment is essentially a bullet the size of your hand, tumbling through the air, ricocheting off surfaces, tearing through pipes and wiring and flesh. And wherever they hit ammunition or fuel, they create new explosions, and those explosions create more fragments. And within seconds, a single shell impact has triggered a cascade of destruction that spreads through the ship like cancer. The Japanese learned this lesson the hard way at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when American battleships using 16-inch armor-piercing shells engaged the Japanese center force. And what's remarkable is that these weren't even direct hits that sank the ships. Many were near misses that struck below the waterline. And because the shells were so heavy and moving so fast, they penetrated the hull even underwater, creating massive holes that let the sea rush in. And the fuses still worked, still detonated after the shells had traveled 20 or 30 feet into the ship's interior. And the combination of explosive force and flooding was unstoppable, because you can't plug a hole when it's surrounded by fires and twisted metal and the ship is already listing 15 degrees. But how exactly did engineers design these shells to penetrate armor that was specifically designed to stop them? Because this is where the physics gets truly fascinating. When a shell strikes armor plate at high velocity, several things happen simultaneously. The shell begins to deform, the armor begins to deform, enormous heat is generated, enough to briefly melt both the shell and the armor at the point of contact, and the outcome depends entirely on the angle of impact, the hardness differential between the shell and the armor, and the shell's velocity at the moment of impact. And getting all of these factors right requires calculations so complex that they're still classified in some countries even today. The Germans solved this problem by developing cap ballistic cap shell designs, where the shell actually has two caps, an armor-piercing cap made of softer steel that cushions the initial impact and prevents the shell from shattering, and a ballistic cap that streamlines the shell's shape for better aerodynamics during flight. And when this shell hits armor, the ballistic cap crumples and falls away, then the armor-piercing cap spreads the impact force, allowing the hardened body of the shell to begin punching through. And the armor plate starts to fail, not by breaking, but by being pushed backward and stretched until it tears, creating a hole just slightly larger than the shell diameter. And the shell passes through, often still spinning from the rifling of the gun barrel, and continues into the ship's interior, where it's primed and ready to detonate. The Americans had their own version, the 16-inch Mark 8 AP shell, and the British used the 15-inch APC round. And while the designs differed in details, the principle was the same. Create a projectile that combines maximum kinetic energy with maximum explosive effect, and make sure it detonates in the worst possible place for the enemy. Now here's something that will send chills down your spine. The men loading these shells into the guns often had no idea what they were handling, because in the heat of battle, in the confined spaces of a ship's magazine and turret, these shells are just objects to be lifted, carried, loaded, and fired as quickly as possible. And the loading crews work in near darkness, illuminated only by red lights that preserve night vision. And they're surrounded by enough explosives to destroy their ship 10 times over. And they know, every single one of them knows, that if an enemy shell penetrates to their position, if the fuse works as designed, they'll never even feel it, because the explosion will be so fast and so total that their nervous system won't have time to register pain. The Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942 demonstrated this with horrifying clarity when USS South Dakota took 42 shell hits from Japanese battleships, and many of those shells were duds or failed to penetrate, but the ones that did penetrate created scenes of indescribable carnage, because the shells didn't just explode, they turned entire compartments into killing chambers, with blast pressure liquefying organs, fragments shredding everything in their path, and fires consuming what remained. And the survivors who made it out described walking through corridors where the walls were no longer recognizable, where the metal had been bent and twisted into shapes that seemed impossible, where they couldn't tell what had been equipment and what had been people. But what secret engineering inside these weapons made them far deadlier than anyone expected? The answer lies in something called the Monroe effect, discovered in the 1880s but not fully exploited until World War II. And here's how it works. If you shape the explosive charge inside the shell in a specific way, specifically if you create a cone-shaped cavity in the explosive, the detonation wave doesn't just expand uniformly in all directions. Instead, it focuses into a jet of superheated gas and molten metal that can punch through armor far thicker than the shell itself could normally penetrate. And while pure-shaped charges wouldn't be perfected until after the war, the principles were already being incorporated into naval shell design, creating explosives that didn't just push, they burned and cut and drilled their way through whatever they encountered. The Japanese Type 91 armor-piercing shell took a different approach. Instead of maximizing explosive content, they maximized penetration by using an extremely long, heavy shell with a reinforced nose designed specifically to punch through the thick deck armor of American battleships. And these shells were so heavy, over 3,000 pounds, that loading them was a crew effort requiring perfect coordination. And when they struck, they fell from such high angles that they could penetrate decks that were otherwise immune to flat trajectory fire, dropping down through multiple levels of the ship before exploding deep in the vitals. And this design philosophy would prove devastatingly effective at Pearl Harbor, when armor-piercing shells converted from old battleship ammunition were used to sink USS Arizona. And the resulting explosion, when the shell detonated in the forward magazine, was so massive it lifted the entire bow of the ship out of the water before it disintegrated. Now imagine you're an engineer in 1943, and you've been tasked with making these shells even more deadly, because the war has reached a stalemate and both sides are desperate for any advantage. And you realize that the limiting factor isn't the explosive or the penetration. It's the fuse reliability, because too many shells are still failing to detonate, either exploding too early or passing completely through targets without triggering. And so you begin experimenting with base detonating fuses that are protected from the initial impact shock, and with combination fuses that have both impact and delay functions, ensuring that the shell explodes one way or another. And with these improvements, the kill rate per hit increases dramatically, from roughly 30% effectiveness to over 80%. Meaning that 8 out of 10 shells that strike a ship will now detonate exactly where they'll cause maximum damage. The Germans even experimented with base bleed technology, adding a small rocket motor to the base of the shell that would fire during flight, reducing air resistance and extending range. And while these shells were never perfected during the war, the concept would later influence post-war artillery design, proving that even in defeat, German engineering was pushing boundaries that wouldn't be reached by others for decades. But here's the thing about these weapons that nobody talks about. They were only as good as the men who aimed them, because hitting a moving ship from 15 miles away while your own ship is also moving and rolling in heavy seas requires calculations so complex that they couldn't be done by hand. And this is where fire control systems come in. Mechanical computers that take input from rangefinders, radar, speed indicators, wind sensors, and temperature gauges. And these computers are themselves engineering marvels, containing thousands of gears and cams and servos, all working together to predict where the enemy ship will be 30 seconds in the future when the ships finally arrive. And the fact that they worked at all, the fact that shells fired from beyond visual range could strike targets with any accuracy, is a testament to human ingenuity and mathematical genius. The Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944 showcased this technology at its peak, when American battleships using radar fire control engaged Japanese warships in total darkness, firing shells that had been obsolete for years but were still deadly when guided by modern targeting systems. And the Japanese ships, unable to see their attackers, unable to return fire effectively, were systematically destroyed. Their armor penetrated, their magazines ignited, their crews killed by shells that arrived from nowhere and everywhere at once. And here's where the story takes a darker turn, because as the war progressed, as the death toll mounted, and victory became more important than humanity, engineers on both sides began asking a terrible question: how can we make these shells kill more efficiently? And the answer they came up with was simple and horrific. Fill them with additional incendiary compounds, materials that don't just explode, but burn, and burn at temperatures so high they can't be extinguished with water. And some shells were loaded with white phosphorus, which ignites on contact with air and continues burning even underwater, creating smoke so thick it chokes anyone who breathes it. And other shells contained thermite, which burns at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit and melts through steel deck plating like butter. And these incendiary shells weren't just designed to sink ships, they were designed to turn them into crematoriums, to ensure that even if the crew survived the initial explosion, they wouldn't survive the fires that followed. The firebombing of the German battleship Tirpitz in 1944 demonstrated this principle, though from the air rather than from naval guns. When British Lancaster bombers dropped massive tallboy bombs that didn't need to hit the ship directly, the near-miss explosions created shock waves in the water that buckled the hull plates and fractured internal structures, and then the fire started. And even though Tirpitz was in shallow water and couldn't sink, she was destroyed from within by fires that burned for days, cooking off ammunition, melting equipment, and making the wreck uninhabitable and irreparable. But let's return to the shells themselves, because there's one more aspect of their design that makes them truly nightmare fuel: the sound they make in flight. When a 16-inch shell is fired, it's traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, creating a sonic boom that can be heard for miles. And as the shell flies, it sheds velocity but maintains a supersonic speed for most of its trajectory, and the sound it makes, described by survivors as a freight train mixed with a scream, is a psychological weapon in itself. Because you hear it approaching, you know something massive is about to hit, but you have no idea where, and the seconds between hearing the sound and feeling the impact are filled with pure terror. And some men broke under that pressure, their minds unable to cope with the certainty of incoming death combined with the uncertainty of location. The Japanese called these shells water hammers when they struck near their ships, because even a near miss, a shell that landed in the water just feet from the hull, created a pressure wave strong enough to pop rivets, crack welds, and injure crew through the hull plating. And in some cases, near misses were actually more damaging than penetrating hits, because they created hull breaches below the waterline that were impossible to repair while under fire, and the ship would slowly flood, gradually lose buoyancy, and eventually capsize or sink stern first as water reached the engine rooms. And speaking of engine rooms, this is where the true horror of these shells becomes apparent. Because when a shell penetrates to the engineering spaces, where the boilers and turbines are located, and detonates, it doesn't just destroy the machinery, it releases superheated steam at pressures exceeding 600 psi, and that steam fills the compartments in seconds, cooking everyone inside alive. And the death is neither quick nor painless, and the screams of men trapped in those spaces could be heard through the voice tubes and ventilation shafts throughout the ship. And there was nothing anyone could do because entering the engineering spaces meant certain death, and the doors were sealed to prevent the steam from spreading to other parts of the ship. And the men inside knew they'd been abandoned, knew they were going to die. And some of them chose to end it faster by jumping into the boilers themselves rather than waiting for the steam to do its work. This is the reality of naval warfare that no one wants to talk about. The shells don't just sink ships, they destroy lives in the most brutal ways imaginable. And the engineers who designed them knew this, knew exactly what their creations would do, and they designed them anyway because that was their job, because the enemy was doing the same thing, because in total war, the only thing that matters is winning, and the cost in human suffering is just another calculation, another variable in the equation. The final year of the war saw the ultimate evolution of these shells, the American 16-inch super heavy shell, weighing 2,700 pounds and containing 440 pounds of explosive, designed specifically to penetrate the heaviest armor on Japanese battleships. And these shells were so large that only 3 could be carried per gun turret, and loading them required hydraulic assistance because no crew could physically lift something that massive. And when they hit with the kinetic energy of a freight train traveling at 200 miles per hour, and nothing, absolutely nothing could withstand that impact. Not the thickest armor, not the most heavily reinforced bulkheads, not concrete, not hope. But by the time these shells were perfected, by the time the engineers had solved every problem and eliminated every weakness, the age of the battleship was already ending, because a different kind of weapon was emerging: aircraft carrying torpedoes and bombs, and these weapons could strike from above, bypassing armor belts entirely. And suddenly all that engineering genius, all those precision-crafted shells, all that mathematical perfection became obsolete, rendered irrelevant by planes that cost a fraction of what a battleship cost and could deliver similar destruction with none of the vulnerability. The last battleship versus battleship engagement in history occurred in October 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And after that, these magnificent and terrible weapons were never used in anger again. And the ships that carried them were either scrapped or converted into museum pieces, and the shells were dumped into the ocean by the thousands, still live, still dangerous, creating underwater hazards that persist to this day. Because even now, 80 years later, some of those shells are still chemically stable, still capable of detonation if disturbed, lying on the ocean floor like dormant dragons, waiting. And that's perhaps the most fitting end for weapons that were designed to be the ultimate expression of naval power. Relegated to the depths, forgotten but not gone. A reminder that human ingenuity, when directed toward destruction, can create things of terrible beauty and beautiful terror. Things that outlast their purpose, their era, and their creators. Things that continue to exist in the dark places of the world, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb them. The men who designed these shells are gone now, and the men who loaded them, and the men who fired them, and the men who died from them. But the shells themselves remain, in museums, in storage depots, in the ocean. Physical evidence of a time when the world poured its genius into figuring out the most efficient ways to kill. And we look at them now through glass cases, read the specifications, admire the engineering, and we forget, or perhaps we never knew, that each one represents not just technology, but choice. Human choice, the decision to create something whose only purpose was to tear apart other things that humans created and to tear apart the humans inside them. If you love discovering the deadly secrets of WW2 weapons, make sure to subscribe, because a new video revealing even more hidden truths is coming very soon. And trust me, you won't want to miss what we're uncovering.